By 1861, the United States was in full civil war. All of Field's U.S. telegraph facilities were quickly put at the disposal of the Union. The United States government wanted to keep in constant communication with its Union forces from Washington, D.C.
During the beginning of the Civil War, Field stayed in fairly close contact with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln consulted with Field because despite Field's failure with the 1858 expedition, he acquired an immense amount of knowledge regarding the practicalities of laying telegraphic cable a long distance.
Cyrus Field was extremely patriotic, in fact, a selfless patriot. He was a real supporter of the Union. At no cost to the government, he extended his telegraph service to the War Department and to the Navy Yard and other strategic points around the capital. His services proved invaluable to the Union.
But during America's Civil War, Field kept his dream alive of a transatlantic cable. Traveling between America and England 31 times during the 4-year war, he was eventually successful in raising capital. British investors again rose to the challenge of backing such an attempt. Americans, on the other hand, were still partial to the advice of Western Union. Nevertheless, Field got his money. It was time to order cable. This time, instead of fabricating the wire in pieces, the entire cable, all 2,600 miles of it, was made in one piece. The manufacturers kept their factory going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in order to complete the cable on schedule. It took 8 months to make at approximately 14 miles per day. The finished cable weighed in at 9,000 tons.
Of course, this one piece, 9,000 tons, meant that the factory had to be right on the waterfront, and so the cable was then pulled from the factory tanks over a line of pulleys and coiled into the tanks on the ship. Incidentally, this is exactly how it's done these days. Nothing has changed there.
9,000 tons of cable was a heck of a lot of cable. There was only one ship in the world that was large enough to carry such a load, and that was Great Eastern.
The Great Eastern was the world's largest steamship of its day, a ship so large it was unable to turn a profit and had bankrupted 3 previous owners, but for laying cable, it was perfect.
So it was basically available. And that was added to the arsenal of the Atlantic cable entrepreneurs, and they gutted it and put cable tanks down in the hold, and now the entire cable could be carried by this one ship.
A crew of 500 men was needed to operate the ship, of which 200 were needed merely to raise its anchor. Supporting this crew and feeding it meant the Great Eastern carried a dozen oxen for deck work, plus 20 pigs for breeding meat while at sea, 1 cow, 120 sheep, and a whole poultry yard of fowl. When finally loaded, the Great Eastern weighed 21,000 tons. July 23, 1865, the Great Eastern set sail westward with little fanfare. No parties, no speeches, just serious business.
They got about 80 miles out and a defect was noticed in the cable. It looked as though a pin had been embedded in the cable. They cut out the bad section, spliced it back together, continued on. Several days later, they noticed another pin in the cable. At that time, Field and others became suspicious of what was going on and suspected sabotage.
Field was in a rage, and he promptly posted a 24-hour security watch over the cable tanks. Often it was Field himself who stood guard. He was taking no chances.
Field was on board for every attempt to lay the Atlantic cable. He spent many nights on deck. He was just obsessed with the whole project. Nothing was going to get in the way of him. Sabotage, money, political problems. The
possibility of sabotage would turn out to be only a minor setback. With only 600 miles of wire left to lay, disaster struck again.
The cable fouled in the machinery and snapped. Whipping like a snake, the broken end of the cable plunged into the sea as the dismayed crew looked on. $5 million worth of cable, $250 million in today's money, sunk into the Atlantic Ocean, into one of its deepest sections, and disappeared.
With the future of international communications at stake, the crew struggled to grapple the cable and bring it to the surface. They turned the enormous ship perpendicular to the cable and zigzagged back and forth while dragging a grappling hook on the ocean floor.
They spent 9 days and nights grappling for the cable. They recovered it on occasions, but before they could hoist it to the surface and fasten it to the ship, it broke again. And this happened a number of times. And finally, they were running short of fuel and provisions, and the decision was made to return to Ireland.
Western Union's plan to go around the world the long way again looked to be the best.
After the failure of the 1865 expedition, Field was still enthusiastic about the project. He knew it could be done. His enthusiasm rubbed off on others around him, and he eventually was able to drum up the capital to order another 2,500 miles of even better cable than previous expeditions.
But Field didn't forget about the previous year's cable. With better grappling equipment, he knew it was possible to salvage the lost wire and complete that circuit too. On June 13, 1866, the 700-foot-long Great Eastern left Valentia Island, paying out the new cable all the way to Heart's Content, Trinity Bay, Newfoundland, landing the shore and on July 27th, without incident.
One can only imagine the elation Cyrus Field must have felt. This was 12 long years in the making, 4 major attempts, and millions of dollars. Finally, he had beaten the odds.
On the banks of Newfoundland, greeting the great ship were hundreds of men, women, and children who helped bring in the shore end of the cable over a floating bridge of 40 fishing boats. From Heart's Content, Field immediately sent the following message to Ireland.
We arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning. All well, thank God. The cable is laid and is in perfect working order.
But Field's job was not over. There was still the lost cable of the previous year sitting on the bottom of the ocean. They ordered the ship back out to sea, 680 miles east. Several days later, the crew began grappling for the broken cable of 1865. They grappled for the lost cable 30 times before it was eventually found and lifted out of the water on September 1st, 1866. The wire was then spliced and the rest of the previous year's cable paid out. The Great Eastern once again landed in Newfoundland, completing a second parallel circuit across the Atlantic Ocean.
From that point on, with only occasional interruptions, this country, America, and Europe, England, so forth, have been in constant electrical communication.
With the news of Field's successful transatlantic telegraph cable, Western Union, the company many Americans thought to be infallible, finally accepted defeat. On February 27, 1867, after having its project stalled by Siberian winters, Western Union abandoned its attempt to reach Europe by way of Alaska and Siberia.
Cyrus Field's great obsession for epic projects didn't end with the transatlantic cable. He was always ready for new challenges. In fact, he had a voracious appetite for them. He went on to help build the New York Elevated Railroad.
Unfortunately, Field partnered up with the infamous Jay Gould and Russell Sage.
Field thought that tariff for the railroad should be as low as possible so that everyone could use them, and ultimately that would be better business. Russell Sage and Jay Gould were of the school that you squeezed as much money as you could out of anyone. Field prevailed in terms of keeping the rates low on the railroad. Unfortunately, both Jay Gould and Russell Sage held it against him for the rest of their lives, and they ultimately squeezed him on a stock transaction, and Cyrus Field lost $5 million in one day and died a broke man.
Field died on December 2nd, 1891, but his dream lived on. By 1915, there were no less than 15 transatlantic telegraph cables stretching across the floor of the Atlantic. While the cables performed flawlessly, there was one major drawback. Because of the enormous length of the cable, the wires couldn't handle the complex and high-speed impulses of speech, which now dominated the majority of land telegraph cables, thanks to Alexander Graham Bell's invention, the telephone. After 40 years of faithful service, the telegraph and its cables were now in trouble. The price of a telegram to Europe in 1866 was $1.25 per word. Today, allowing for inflation, it is 60 times cheaper.